The rain drummed against the office windows like fingers tapping impatiently on glass. Sarah Thompson watched the droplets race down the pane, each one carrying away another piece of her hope. She didn't know that in exactly 43 minutes, her entire world would crumble and rebuild itself in ways she never imagined possible. Welcome back. Tell me from which city you are watching me and what time it is there. Now, listen to this story. Sarah pressed her trembling fingers against the keyboard, typing the monthly reports that no one would ever thank her for. Her supervisor, Gregory Hale, sat 30 feet away, his voice booming through phone calls about profit margins and cost reductions. To him, she was furniture. Useful, replaceable furniture. 7-year-old Max waited for her at the after-school program. Again. She promised him McDonald's for dinner because she couldn't afford groceries until Friday. The shame burned in her chest like acid, but she swallowed it down. She always swallowed it down. Have you ever felt invisible in a room full of people? Sarah had mastered that art. 22 months she'd worked at Nexacor, Seattle's mid-sized tech firm nestled between the glittering towers of downtown. 22 months of arriving early, staying late, and watching Gregory take credit for her work. 22 months of polite smiles when he called her Sally instead of Sarah. 22 months of pretending it didn't matter. But today felt different. The financial reports spread across her desk told a story that made her stomach twist. Numbers that didn't add up, expenses that vanished into thin air, money flowing to accounts that shouldn't exist. She stared at the screen until her eyes burned. Then she printed everything onto paper that felt like evidence in her hands. Heavy, dangerous, important. Gregory's laughter echoed from his office, sharp and hollow. Sarah folded the papers and slipped them into her purse. Her grandmother's voice whispered from memory. Sometimes the most important truths hide in plain sight, little bird. Her grandmother had been part Suquamish, part Irish immigrant, all wisdom. She taught Sarah that silence wasn't always weakness. Sometimes it was strategy. But Sarah wondered if she'd been silent too long. The phone on her desk shrieked. Gregory's voice crackled through the speaker like breaking glass. Sally, get in here, now. Sarah's hands trembled as she walked toward his office. The carpet beneath her feet felt like quicksand, each step pulling her deeper into something she couldn't escape. The hallway stretched endlessly, fluorescent lights humming their monotone song of corporate despair. Gregory didn't look up when she entered. He kept typing, his fingers attacking the keyboard like a woodpecker drilling into dead wood. The silence stretched between them, thick and poisonous. Sit down, he said finally, still not looking at her. Sarah perched on the edge of the chair, her back straight, hands folded. 22 months of practice had taught her how to make herself small, how to take up as little space as possible in a world that reminded her daily she didn't belong. The Morrison account is 3 days behind schedule, Gregory said, his voice flat as concrete. The client called this morning. Furious doesn't begin to cover it. Sarah's mouth went dry. Sir, I submitted the preliminary reports on Monday, and I've been waiting for your approval to move forward with the final phase. I sent 3 emails. Don't. Gregory's palm hit the desk like a gunshot. Don't make excuses. Don't blame me for your incompetence. I'm sick of covering for you. The words hit her like physical blows, each syllable designed to cut, to diminish, to erase whatever dignity she thought she possessed. Sarah felt her grandmother's wedding ring, the only thing of value she owned, press against her finger like a reminder. I understand you're upset, sir, but if we could review the timeline together, I think you'd see. You think? Gregory laughed, but there was no humor in it. Only cruelty. You think you understand business? You think you understand pressure? Lady, you file papers and answer phones. You're a secretary with delusions of grandeur. The air in the room turned thick. Sarah couldn't breathe properly. Her throat closed around words she wanted to say but couldn't. This man had never seen her work until 3 in the morning. He'd never watched her son eat cereal for dinner because she'd given him her portion of real food. He'd never known what it meant to choose between rent and medicine. Sir, with respect, I've handled the Morrison account from the beginning. I know every detail, every deadline. If you'd just give me one more day. One more day. Gregory stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. One more day to what? Mess up something else? Cost us more money? Sarah stared at the floor, counting the scratches in the wood. 1, 2, 3. Each mark a small violence accumulated over time, like the wounds Gregory had been inflicting on her spirit for almost 2 years. I'm done, he said, his voice quiet now. Quiet was worse than yelling. Quiet meant finality. Clean out your desk. Security will escort you out in 15 minutes. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had just consumed everything she'd worked for. Sarah's vision blurred, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not here. Not in front of him. Sir, please, I have a son. This job means everything to my family. If you could just— 15 minutes, Gregory repeated, already turning back to his computer. And Sally, don't use me as a reference. Sarah walked out of that office feeling like she was drowning in air. The hallways seemed to stretch forever, past co-workers who suddenly found their computer screens fascinating, past the break room where she'd eaten countless lonely lunches, past the motivational posters that promised success to those who worked hard and stayed positive. Her legs moved automatically toward her desk, muscle memory guiding her while her mind reeled. 7 years old. Max was 7 years old and he needed school supplies and winter clothes, and a mother who could provide basic stability. How would she explain this? How would she find another job that paid enough to keep their tiny apartment? The cardboard box from supply storage felt heavier than it should have. Inside went her coffee mug, the one Max had decorated with handprints for Mother's Day. Her small potted plant, somehow still alive despite the office's fluorescent wasteland. A photo of Max losing his 2 front teeth, grinning like he'd won the lottery. Carmen from accounting walked by, her eyes full of sympathy and fear. Fear that she might be next. Fear that kindness might be contagious and cost her own job. Sarah understood. In places like this, compassion was a luxury nobody could afford. I'm sorry, Carmen whispered as she passed, but she didn't stop walking. Sarah nodded, focusing on the task of packing. If she thought too hard about what came next, she'd collapse right here between the filing cabinets and the industrial carpet that smelled like defeat. The security guard arrived exactly 15 minutes later. Young, apologetic, but firm. He waited while Sarah gathered the last of her belongings, her movements careful and deliberate. She wouldn't give Gregory the satisfaction of seeing her hurry or panic. The elevator descended in silence, carrying her away from the only steady income she'd had since Max was born. Outside, Seattle's March rain had intensified, transforming the sidewalks into rivers that carried away everything loose and unprotected. Sarah stood under the building's overhang, watching the rain and trying to calculate how long her savings would last. 6 weeks if she was careful. 4 if Max needed anything unexpected. She pulled out her phone to call the after-school program, to tell them she'd be late picking up Max because she was having car trouble. Another small lie in the endless series of lies she told to protect him from the truth of their situation. But before she could dial, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Thompson, this is Janet Morrison from Morrison & Associates law firm. We need to speak with you urgently regarding a matter of inheritance. Please call as soon as possible. Sarah stared at the message until the words blurred. Inheritance. She had no family left except Max, no relatives who'd ever acknowledged her existence, no mysterious benefactors waiting in the wings. This had to be a mistake, or worse, some kind of scam targeting people like her. People desperate enough to believe in miracles. She almost deleted the message, almost dismissed it as another cruel joke the universe was playing on her already devastating day. But something in the formal tone, something in the timing made her pause. The law firm's number was real when she searched it online. Morrison & Associates had been practicing in Seattle for 47 years. Their website showed a respectable downtown office, testimonials from satisfied clients, news articles about successful cases. With nothing left to lose, Sarah called. Morrison and Associates, this is Janet Morrison speaking. This is Sarah Thompson. I received a text about an inheritance. A pause. Then, Ms. Thompson, thank you for calling. I realize this must seem unusual, but we have a matter of considerable urgency to discuss with you. Would it be possible for you to come to our office today? Sarah looked down at her cardboard box of office belongings, soggy from the rain. At her reflection in the building's glass doors, distorted and wavering like something not quite real. Today has been complicated, she said carefully. Could you tell me what this is about? It concerns your grandfather, Ms. Thompson, Franklin Northcott. The name hit Sarah like cold water. She'd never heard it before in her life, but something deep inside her recognized it. Some genetic memory stirring after decades of silence. I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong person. I don't have a grandfather named Franklin anything. Ms. Thompson, Janet Morrison's voice grew gentle. I understand your confusion. Your mother never told you about him, did she? Sarah's knees nearly buckled. The rain suddenly sounded louder, the traffic more aggressive, the world more hostile. How could a stranger know anything about her mother? Her mother who died when Sarah was 19, taking all family secrets with her to the grave. Who was my grandfather? Sarah whispered. The founder and original owner of Nexacor Industries. The phone slipped from Sarah's fingers and clattered to the wet pavement. She stared at it lying there among the cigarette butts and urban debris, Janet Morrison's voice now a tiny, tinny sound bleeding into the rain. Above her, 47 floors up, Gregory Hale was probably already interviewing her replacement. Someone younger maybe, or cheaper, or more willing to absorb his daily doses of contempt. He had no idea that the woman he'd just discarded like broken furniture was connected to the very foundation of his employment. Sarah picked up the phone with trembling fingers. Janet Morrison was still talking, patient and professional. Are you there, Ms. Thompson? I'm here, Sarah managed. I need to understand. You're telling me that my grandfather founded Nexacor, the company I just got fired from 10 minutes ago? Another pause. You were employed there? Ms. Thompson, this complicates things considerably. We need to meet immediately. Have you ever had a moment when everything you thought you knew about your life suddenly shifted? Sarah found herself agreeing to meet at Morrison and Associates at 4 o'clock. That gave her 2 hours to pick up Max, figure out what to tell him about why she was home early, and somehow process the impossible information that her dead mother had hidden an entire family history from her. The after-school program director looked surprised when Sarah arrived 40 minutes early. Miss Patricia had run the program for 12 years and knew which parents came early because they were excited, and which came early because their world was falling apart. She took one look at Sarah's face and quietly suggested that Max might enjoy some extra art time, while his mom took a few minutes to sit in the parent lounge. Sarah watched her son through the glass partition, his small hands carefully cutting construction paper into shapes she couldn't identify. The same concentration she'd inherited from her mother. The same stubborn cowlick that refused to lie flat no matter how much water she used in the mornings. What else had she inherited without knowing it? Her mother had been a practical woman, suspicious of stories that sounded too good to be true. She'd worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat after Sarah's father disappeared when Sarah was 6. She'd taught Sarah to rely on herself, to expect nothing from others, to make her own way in a world that didn't owe her anything. Why would she have hidden the existence of a grandfather who owned a business? Why would she have let them struggle and scrape when there might have been help available? Unless the help had come with strings attached. Unless Franklin Northcott had been the kind of man who used money as a weapon, who demanded loyalty and control in exchange for security. Sarah's mother had valued independence above comfort, dignity above ease. But how could Sarah know any of this without asking questions that could never be answered? Max looked up from his art project and waved, his missing tooth grin bright enough to power the entire building. He had no idea that their lives had just shifted into some alternate reality where his mother might be connected to wealth and power. He just knew she was there early, which meant more time together, which was always good news in his 7-year-old universe. "Ready to go home, buddy?" Sarah called through the partition. "5 more minutes? I'm making something special." Sarah checked her phone. 3:20. She could give him 5 minutes and still make the 4 o'clock appointment that might change everything, or explain nothing, or turn out to be an elaborate mistake that would leave her more lost than before. What would you do in her situation? Trust the impossible possibility, or protect yourself from more disappointment? The Morrison & Associates building stood downtown like an old-fashioned promise. Brick and timber, solid and permanent in a city increasingly dominated by glass and steel. Sarah climbed the steps slowly, Max's small hand in hers, her mind racing through conversation scenarios that all ended with confusion or humiliation. The lobby smelled like leather and wood polish, like success earned through decades of careful work. The receptionist smiled genuinely when Sarah gave her name, no hint of the dismissive politeness Sarah was used to receiving from professional settings. "Ms. Morrison is waiting for you in the conference room, and this must be Max. We have some coloring books and puzzles if he'd like to sit in our children's area." Max looked up at Sarah for permission, his eyes wide at the mention of special activities just for kids. She nodded, watching him settle into a corner space designed specifically for young visitors. This law firm understood that legal matters affected entire families, not just the adults who signed papers. Janet Morrison turned out to be a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and calloused hands that suggested she'd worked her way up from less privileged beginnings. She gestured Sarah into a chair across from a table covered with documents, photographs, and what looked like architectural plans. "Thank you for coming, especially on such short notice, and after what sounds like a difficult day," Janet said, settling into her own chair. "Before we begin, I want you to know that everything we discuss today is confidential. You're under no obligation to accept anything or sign anything. This meeting is purely informational." Sarah appreciated the reassurance, but her eyes were drawn to a black and white photograph in the center of the table. A man in his 30s, wearing a suit from what looked like the 1970s, standing in front of a building she recognized as the original Nexacor headquarters. "That's Franklin Northcott," Janet said, following Sarah's gaze. "Your grandfather. And this," she slid another photo across the table, "is your mother at 18. Sarah's breath caught. The woman in the second photograph had her same dark hair, her same determined jaw, her same way of holding her shoulders like she was ready for whatever came next. But she was smiling in a way Sarah had rarely seen her mother smile. Freely, hopefully, like someone who believed good things were possible. "They look alike," Sarah whispered. "They were stubborn alike, too," Janet said with a slight smile. "Your grandfather spent years trying to reconcile with your mother after their falling out. He hired private investigators to keep track of her life, to make sure she was safe. He knew about you from the day you were born." The words hit Sarah like waves, each revelation washing away another certainty about her childhood. What was their falling out about? Janet opened a manila folder and withdrew a letter, yellowed with age. "Your mother disapproved of some of his business practices. She felt he was prioritizing profit over people, that he was losing sight of the values he'd started the company with. She was 22 when she cut off all contact." Sarah stared at the letter, recognizing her mother's careful handwriting even before Janet handed it to her. The date at the top was 3 months before Sarah's birth. "Dad, I can't watch you become someone I don't recognize." The company was supposed to help people, to create jobs that paid living wages and treated employees like human beings. Instead, you're laying off workers to increase shareholder profits. You're cutting benefits for families who depend on them. You're becoming exactly what we used to criticize about other corporations. If this is what success looks like, I want no part of it. Don't look for me. Don't send money. My child and I will make our own way in the world, with our values intact. Maybe someday you'll remember who you used to be. Love always, despite everything, Margaret." Sarah read the letter twice, her mother's voice echoing in every word. the principled stance against compromise, the fierce independence, the willingness to sacrifice comfort for integrity. He kept this letter on his desk for 23 years, Janet said softly. Every day he looked at it before making business decisions. Your mother's words changed him, Ms. Thompson. He spent the last 2 decades of his life trying to become the man she wanted him to be. This felt like learning about a parallel universe where her family history included wealth and influence instead of overtime shifts and government assistance. Sarah touched her grandmother's wedding ring, suddenly understanding why her mother had never talked about the past. When did he die? Sarah asked. 6 months ago. He'd been battling cancer for 2 years, but he kept working almost until the end. The company meant everything to him, but not in the way you might think. He'd transformed it into exactly what your mother wanted. Employee-owned shares, comprehensive benefits, community outreach programs. He was trying to build a legacy she could have been proud of. Janet pulled out another document, this one crisp and legal-looking. Which brings us to why we're here. Franklin Northcott left his controlling interest in Nexacor to his only grandchild. You, Ms. Thompson. 51% of the company belongs to you. The conference room fell silent except for the sound of Seattle traffic 40 floors below and Max's quiet humming as he colored at the children's table. Sarah stared at the document without seeing it, her mind trying to process numbers that felt like fantasy. 51% of Nexacor. The company where she'd just been fired for being incompetent. The company where Gregory Hale treated employees like disposable resources. The company that employed over 300 people across the state. This can't be real, she whispered. I understand your shock, Janet said. But there's more you need to know. The inheritance comes with conditions. Of course there were conditions. In Sarah's experience, good things always came with catches that made them impossible to accept. She braced herself for the revelation that would snatch away this unbelievable opportunity before she could even process what it meant. Your grandfather set up a trust that requires you to demonstrate leadership of the company according to his values. You have 1 year to implement specific changes, employee profit sharing, community investment programs, environmental sustainability measures. If you succeed, the inheritance becomes permanent. If you don't, the shares revert to a charity foundation. Sarah looked across the room at Max, still contentedly working on his art project. 1 year to prove she could run a company she'd only seen from the perspective of the lowest rung. 1 year to honor grandfather she'd never met, and a mother who died protecting her from exactly this kind of responsibility. What if I don't want it? She asked. Janet studied her carefully. That's your choice, of course, but I should tell you that Nexacor's current management structure would likely sell the company to a large competitor within 2 years. 300 jobs would disappear. The community programs your grandfather built would be eliminated. Everything he and your mother fought about would come true. The weight of 300 families pressed down on Sarah's shoulders. 300 people like her, working to pay rent and buy groceries and give their children better opportunities. 300 people currently under the management of people like Gregory Hale, who saw employees as line items on spreadsheets rather than human beings with dreams and fears and responsibilities. How many of those 300 had been sitting in their own offices 24 hours ago, typing reports and answering phones, and hoping their quiet competence would be enough to keep them safe? How many had children waiting at after-school programs? How many had chosen between groceries and medicine? I need time to think, Sarah said. Of course. But, Ms. Thompson, there's one more thing. The 1-year timeline began 6 months ago, when your grandfather died. You have 6 months left. 6 months. 183 days to learn how to run a business, implement sweeping changes, and somehow transform herself from a fired administrative assistant into a leader capable of honoring her family's complicated legacy. Have you ever faced a choice that felt too big for the person you thought you were? Can I ask you something? Sarah said as Janet began organizing the documents. How did you find me? My mother never used her father's name. I've never been in any system that would connect me to Franklin Northcott. Janet smiled sadly. Your grandfather never stopped looking for you. He had investigators track your mother's marriage records, your birth certificate, your school enrollment. He knew where you lived, where you worked, what kind of mother you were to Max. He was incredibly proud of you, Ms. Thompson. The job you've done raising your son alone, the way you've stayed true to your values despite financial pressure. He saw your mother's strength in everything you did. The idea of being watched and evaluated without her knowledge should have felt invasive, but somehow it didn't. Instead, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since her mother died. The sense that someone in the world understood what she was trying to accomplish and thought she was doing well. He left you letters, Janet continued, pulling a wooden box from beneath the table. One for every birthday he missed, every Christmas he wasn't there for. He wanted you to know your family history, but he also wanted you to know that he understood why your mother made the choices she did. Sarah accepted the box with trembling hands. It was carved cedar, smooth from handling, with small copper hinges that had developed a green patina over time. Inside were dozens of envelopes, each marked with a date and occasion. Sarah's 8th birthday, Sarah's high school graduation, Max's birth. Max's birth. He'd known about Max from the beginning, had cared enough to write letters to a grandson he'd never met. Take them home, Janet said gently. Read them when you're ready. And Ms. Thompson, whatever you decide about the inheritance, those letters belong to you. They're not conditional on anything. Sarah hugged the box against her chest as she collected Max from the children's area. He'd created what appeared to be a family portrait. 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, with a house that had too many windows, and a dog that looked like a cat. Who's that? Sarah asked, pointing to the figures. That's us, Max said proudly. And that's our new house, with a yard so we can get a dog. I decided we're getting a dog soon. 7-year-old optimism. Sarah envied his ability to believe that good things were not only possible, but inevitable. She'd lost that somewhere in the years of struggling and compromising and making herself smaller to fit into spaces that didn't want her. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to remember how to take up space again. The bus ride home gave Sarah time to stare out rain-streaked windows and try to create a mental inventory of everything she knew about business management. The list was discouragingly short. She understood filing systems and scheduling and customer service. She knew how to read financial reports, thanks to her work in Gregory's department. She understood employee frustration because she'd lived it for almost 2 years. Did any of that qualify her to run a company? Their apartment building looked smaller when they returned, the narrow hallways and thin walls more noticeable, after spending time in Morrison & Associates' solid, spacious offices. Sarah unlocked their door to reveal the familiar landscape of careful poverty, furniture gathered from thrift stores and yard sales, toys organized in plastic boxes because they didn't have a dedicated playroom, books stacked on windowsills because they couldn't afford proper shelving. But it was clean and warm, and theirs. Max's drawings covered the refrigerator like colorful proof that creativity could flourish anywhere. Sarah's small herb garden thrived on the fire escape, defying the Seattle rain, and providing fresh basil for the pasta dishes that comprised half their dinner rotation. Mom, can we have spaghetti tonight? Max asked, unpacking his backpack with the systematic efficiency she'd taught him. And can we put on music while we cook? Sarah looked at her son, really looked at him, and tried to imagine what their life might become if she accepted her grandfather's challenge. Better schools, certainly. A house with a yard where he could have that dog he'd drawn. College savings that didn't depend on scholarships and hoping for miracles. But also pressure she'd never experienced. Responsibility for decisions that affected hundreds of families. The possibility of failure on a scale that would devastate more than just their small household. Spaghetti sounds perfect, she said, ruffling his hair. And yes to the music. While Max set the table with the careful attention he gave to all tasks, Sarah opened Franklin Northcott's wooden box and selected the letter marked Sarah's 21st birthday. Her hands shook slightly as she unfolded paper that had been waiting 15 years to be read. My dear granddaughter, today you turn 21 and I wonder what kind of young woman you've become. Are you like your mother, fierce and principled and unafraid to stand up for what you believe in? Are you like me at that age, determined to change the world but not yet wise enough to understand what change requires? I hope you're both. I hope you have Margaret's moral clarity and my stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The world needs people who can see what's wrong and insist on making it better. I've made many mistakes in my life, granddaughter, but losing your mother was the worst. I let business success matter more than family relationships. I let quarterly profits eclipse the values I started Nexacor to promote. I became so focused on building something impressive that I forgot to build something meaningful. Your mother was right to leave. She was right to protect you from the compromises I was making. But I hope someday you'll also understand that people can change, that mistakes can become the foundation for better choices. I'm working to build the company your mother wanted me to create. Every day I ask myself what Margaret would think of the decisions I'm making. Every day I try to be worthy of the second chance she'll never give me, but you might. Happy birthday, sweet girl. I love you more than you know. Your grandfather, Franklin. Sarah wiped tears from her cheeks and refolded the letter carefully. This man she'd never met understood something about responsibility and values that felt familiar, like genetic memory finally awakening. He'd spent years trying to become someone his daughter could forgive, someone his granddaughter could be proud of. What was she willing to spend 6 months trying to become? The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, standard Seattle weather that usually matched Sarah's mood, but today felt like possibility disguised as routine. She made Max's lunch with extra care, including a note that said, "You make every day brighter," then walked him to school through puddles that reflected the sky like scattered mirrors. At 9 o'clock, she called Nexacor's main number. Nexacor Industries, how may I direct your call? I'd like to speak with Gregory Heir, please. A pause. I'm sorry, may I ask who's calling? Sarah took a deep breath. Sarah Thompson, I'm calling about my employment termination yesterday. Another pause, longer this time. Then, please hold while I transfer you. The hold music was aggressively cheerful, designed to convince callers that they were important while simultaneously making them wait long enough to reconsider whatever request had prompted their call. Sarah used the time to practice what she wanted to say, testing different approaches and discarding the ones that sounded too confrontational or too apologetic. Gregory Heir. His voice was brisk, impatient, already annoyed by the interruption. Mr. Heir, this is Sarah Thompson. I'd like to schedule a meeting with you today to discuss company operations. A bark of laughter. Company operations? Lady, you worked here for less than 2 years and you couldn't even handle file management. What could you possibly have to say about company operations? Sarah felt the familiar shrinking sensation, the instinct to apologize and hang up and pretend this conversation had never happened. But then she looked at Franklin Northcott's letters spread across her kitchen table and remembered that she was asking for this meeting as the majority shareholder, not as a former employee seeking reconsideration. Mr. Heir, I'm calling to inform you that I've recently become aware of my controlling interest in Nexacor Industries. As the majority shareholder, I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss the current state of operations and potential changes moving forward. The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah wondered if the call had been disconnected. Then Gregory's voice returned, but stripped of its usual aggressive confidence. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the 51% ownership stake I inherited from Franklin Northcott. I'm talking about my legal right to examine company books, attend board meetings, and participate in major operational decisions. I'm talking about tomorrow at 10 a.m. in the main conference room. This time, the silence stretched long enough for Sarah to count her heartbeats. When Gregory spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled but edged with something that might have been panic. If what you're saying is true, and I'm not saying I believe it is, Then you'll need to present documentation to the board of directors. You can't just walk in here making claims about ownership. Of course, Sarah said calmly. I'll have my attorney present all necessary documentation tomorrow morning. 10 a.m., Mr. Hale. The main conference room. She hung up before he could respond, her hands shaking with adrenaline and terror. In 24 hours, she'd go from being the fired administrative assistant to being the person with the authority to fire the man who'd spent nearly 2 years making her feel worthless. But first, she had to figure out how to be that person. Sarah spent the rest of the morning reading every document Janet Morrison had provided, taking notes in the margins, and creating lists of questions that revealed how much she didn't know about business operations. Sales figures, profit margins, employee satisfaction surveys, community partnership agreements. Each page represented decisions that affected real people's lives. The employee satisfaction survey results were particularly troubling. 63% of Nexacore workers reported feeling undervalued. 47% had considered leaving within the past year. The comments section read like a catalog of small indignities and missed opportunities. Management doesn't listen to employee suggestions. No opportunity for advancement regardless of performance. Feels like we're just numbers on a spreadsheet. Sarah recognized her own experience reflected in every complaint. The sense of being invisible unless you made a mistake. The frustration of watching good ideas disappear into the hierarchy without acknowledgement. The exhaustion of working hard for people who treated dedication as obligation rather than gift. But she also saw opportunity. These employees weren't asking for unreasonable things, just respect, recognition, and the chance to contribute meaningfully to the company's success. Franklin Northcott's vision of employee ownership and community investment could address most of these concerns, while actually improving productivity and retention. The question was whether Sarah could convince a board of directors to support changes that might reduce short-term profits in favor of long-term stability and growth. Actually, the real question was whether she could walk into that conference room tomorrow and project the confidence to lead people who had been making these kinds of decisions for decades. Have you ever had to become a different version of yourself, almost overnight? Max came home from school bubbling with excitement about a science project involving volcanoes and baking soda. He chattered through dinner about chemical reactions and presentation boards, innocently confident that his mother would help him create something amazing because she always did. Sarah listened and asked appropriate questions while her mind cycled through tomorrow's possible scenarios. Best case, the board accepted her ownership claim and listened respectfully to her proposals. Worst case, they challenged her documentation, questioned her qualifications, and made it clear that she might own shares, but didn't belong in their world. Most likely case, something in between that would require her to prove herself repeatedly, while learning complicated lessons in public. "Mom, are you okay?" Max asked, pausing in his volcanic enthusiasm to study her face. "You look worried." Sarah reached across their small table to touch his hand. 7 years old and already skilled at reading her moods, already taking on the emotional responsibility of monitoring his mother's well-being. She wished she could protect him from that burden, could give him the luxury of childhood oblivion to adult concerns. "I'm thinking about work stuff," she said honestly. "Sometimes grown-up decisions are complicated." "Is it like when I have to choose between two good things and both choices seem right?" Sarah smiled despite her anxiety. "Exactly like that, buddy. Exactly like that." That night, after Max was asleep, Sarah read 3 more of Franklin Northcott's letters. Each one revealed a man grappling with the same questions she faced now: how to balance profit with principles, how to make decisions that honored relationships as well as bottom lines, how to lead people instead of just managing them. In the letter marked Sarah's college graduation, he wrote about leadership philosophy. Real leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room or having all the answers. It's about creating space for other people's intelligence to flourish, about listening more than talking, about remembering that every business decision affects human beings who have families and dreams and fears just like you do. The best leaders I've known were people who never forgot where they came from, who understood struggle and sacrifice and the value of honest work. They made decisions from empathy rather than ego. I think your mother would have been that kind of leader. I hope you will be too. Sarah closed the letter and looked around their tiny apartment, at Max's artwork covering the walls, at her small but thriving herb garden, at the shelf of library books she checked out religiously because buying books was a luxury they couldn't afford. This was where she came from. This was the perspective she'd bring to Nexacor's boardroom. Not the polished confidence of someone born to wealth and privilege, but the hard-earned wisdom of someone who understood what happened to families when businesses prioritized profits over people. Maybe that was exactly the kind of leadership Franklin Northcott had hoped she'd provide. Sarah Thompson walked into Nexacor Industries the next morning, carrying her grandfather's letters in her purse and Janet Morrison's documents in a leather briefcase borrowed from her neighbor. She wore her best suit, the one she'd bought for job interviews 2 years ago, and her grandmother's wedding ring polished to catch the light. The receptionist who'd always treated her with polite dismissiveness looked confused when Sarah appeared in the lobby at 9:45. Ms. Thompson? I thought you were… aren't you supposed to… I have a meeting with the board of directors at 10, Sarah said calmly. Could you please let them know I've arrived? Of course, just give me a moment to confirm. Sarah watched the young woman, Jennifer, her nameplate read, make a series of increasingly urgent phone calls while occasionally glancing at Sarah with obvious bewilderment. Finally, Gregory Hale emerged from the elevator, his face a carefully constructed mask of professional courtesy that didn't quite hide his underlying hostility. Sarah, he said, her name sounding like an accusation. I have to admit, I'm curious to see what documentation you think proves your claims. Good morning, Gregory. I appreciate you making time for this meeting on short notice. Sarah had practiced that response dozens of times in front of her bathroom mirror, working to strike the right balance between politeness and authority. She needed to establish her legitimacy without unnecessarily provoking the people whose cooperation she'd ultimately need to succeed. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like ascending into foreign territory. Sarah had never been above the 3rd floor, had never seen the executive offices or the boardroom where company decisions were made. The hallway carpet was thicker here, the artwork more expensive, the very air somehow cleaner and more rarefied. The board is waiting in the main conference room, Gregory said, leading her past offices with views of Elliott Bay that must have cost more per month than her annual rent. I should warn you that they're somewhat skeptical of your claims. I understand their skepticism, Sarah replied. I'd be skeptical too, in their position. The conference room was all windows and polished mahogany, designed to project success and authority. 5 people sat around the massive table, their expressions ranging from curious to annoyed to openly hostile. Sarah recognized 2 of them from company newsletters, the CFO and the head of human resources. But the others were strangers who looked like they'd been making important decisions since before she was born. Ladies and gentlemen, Gregory said with false joviality, this is Sarah Thompson, who claims to have inherited controlling interest in our company. Janet Morrison entered behind them, carrying her own briefcase and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she'd been looking forward to this moment for months. Good morning, everyone, Janet said, moving to stand beside Sarah at the head of the table. I'm Janet Morrison, representing the estate of Franklin Northcott and, as of yesterday, Ms. Thompson's interests as majority shareholder. Shall we begin with the documentation? For the next 40 minutes, Sarah listened to Janet methodically present the legal foundation of her inheritance claim. Death certificates, wills, trust documents, corporate bylaws, DNA testing results that confirmed her relationship to Franklin Northcott. A paper trail so comprehensive and professional that the board's skepticism gradually shifted to resigned acceptance. So you're telling us, said the CFO, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who kept checking his phone, that this administrative assistant somehow owns 51% of our company? Former administrative assistant, Sarah corrected quietly. And yes, that's exactly what we're telling you. The woman sitting across from her, Eleanor Chen according to the nameplate, leaned forward with obvious interest. Ms. Thompson, assuming this is all legitimate, what exactly do you plan to do with this ownership stake? Do you intend to sell it? Because I can tell you right now that several larger firms would be very interested in acquiring Nexacor. Sarah stood up, partly because sitting made her feel small and partly because she needed to move to control her nerves. She walked to the windows overlooking downtown Seattle, gathering her thoughts while studying the city where she'd struggled and survived, and somehow ended up in this impossible position. 6 months ago, she said without turning around, my grandfather died believing that businesses should serve communities, not just shareholders. He spent the last 20 years of his life trying to transform Nexacor into the kind of company that creates value for everyone, employees, customers, neighbors, and yes, shareholders too. She turned back to face the board, making eye contact with each member in turn. I'm not interested in selling Nexacor. I'm interested in finishing what he started. Gregory laughed, but it sounded forced. And what qualifications do you have to run a multi-million-dollar company? What experience in management, in strategic planning, in any of the skills required for executive leadership? Sarah had been expecting this question, had spent hours crafting an answer that acknowledged her inexperience, while highlighting the perspective she brought to the role. You're right that I don't have traditional executive experience, she said. But I have something that might be more valuable. I understand what it's like to work for this company as a regular employee. I know what motivates people and what demoralizes them. I've seen how management decisions affect families and communities. She opened her briefcase and withdrew the employee satisfaction survey, spreading copies around the table. According to this survey, 63% of our employees feel undervalued. 47% are considering leaving. That's not a personnel problem. That's a leadership problem. When good people feel invisible and unappreciated, productivity suffers, creativity dies, and eventually they leave for companies that treat them better. Eleanor Chen was actually reading the survey results, her expression thoughtful. These numbers are concerning, I'll give you that. But employee satisfaction is just one metric. We also have to consider profitability, market share, competitive positioning, all of which improve when employees are engaged and committed to the company's success, Sarah said. My grandfather proved that over the last 2 decades. Nexacor's profits increased every year while he was implementing employee-friendly policies. She gestured to Janet, who began distributing financial reports showing the company's steady growth under Franklin Northcott's leadership. Employee profit-sharing programs, comprehensive benefits, community investment initiatives, these weren't just feel-good policies, Sarah continued. They were smart business strategies that reduced turnover, increased productivity, and built customer loyalty. The CFO studied the financial reports with obvious surprise. I had no idea Franklin had implemented profit sharing, or that the community programs were generating this much positive publicity. Because he did it quietly, Sarah said. He wasn't interested in credit or recognition. He was interested in results, and the results speak for themselves. Gregory had been growing more agitated throughout the presentation. Now he stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward with enough force to hit the wall. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice rising. We're supposed to hand over control of this company to someone who doesn't even understand basic business principles? Someone who got fired for incompetence 2 days ago? Sarah felt the familiar shrinking sensation, the automatic response to Gregory's aggressive tone. But then she thought about Max eating cereal for dinner, about 300 families depending on Nexacor for their livelihoods, about her grandfather spending 20 years trying to honor her mother's principles. Mr. Hale, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I wasn't fired for incompetence. I was fired because you needed someone to blame for your own poor planning and communication. The Morrison account was delayed because you failed to approve the preliminary reports for 3 days, then blamed me for not being a mind reader. The room fell silent. Sarah could hear the distant hum of Seattle traffic and the quiet sound of her own breathing. Furthermore, she continued, I've spent the last 22 months watching you treat employees like disposable resources. I've seen you take credit for other people's work, ignore valuable suggestions, and create a workplace culture based on fear rather than collaboration. That's not leadership. That's just bullying with a title. Gregory's face flushed red. How dare you? I dare because I own 51% of this company, Sarah said firmly. Which means I have the authority to implement changes that will benefit everyone, employees, customers, and shareholders, starting today. Eleanor Chen looked intrigued rather than offended. What kind of changes are you proposing? Sarah opened her grandfather's trust documents to the section outlining required implementations. Employee profit sharing within 90 days, expanded healthcare benefits including mental health and childcare support, management training focused on collaborative leadership rather than authoritarian control, community investment programs that create local partnerships and positive publicity. She looked directly at Gregory. And a comprehensive review of current management practices to ensure they align with the company's stated values. The CFO leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with new interest. These changes would require significant upfront investment. How do you plan to maintain profitability during the transition? Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the room. The same way my grandfather did, by treating people well enough that they want to contribute to the company's success, instead of just collecting paychecks while looking for better opportunities elsewhere. What would you do if you found yourself defending principles you'd never had the power to implement before? The meeting continued for another hour, with board members asking increasingly detailed questions about implementation timelines, budget allocation, and success metrics. Sarah answered what she could and took notes on questions that required research and consultation with experts. By noon, 3 things were clear. Her ownership claim was legally unassailable. Her proposed changes were financially viable, and Gregory Hale was going to fight her every step of the way. I'll need time to review all of this, Eleanor Chen said as the meeting finally concluded. But Ms. Thompson, I have to ask, are you prepared for the reality of running a company? The long hours, the difficult decisions, the pressure from shareholders and employees and regulators? It's not like managing files and answering phones. Sarah gathered her papers slowly, thinking about Eleanor's question. Was she prepared? Probably not. But was she willing to learn? Absolutely. Ms. Chen, she said finally. 6 months ago, I was a single mother living paycheck to paycheck, trying to give my son a stable life while working for people who treated me like I was invisible. Yesterday, I got fired from that job and discovered I'd inherited a multi-million-dollar company. Today, I walked into this room and convinced a board of directors to consider implementing changes that could affect hundreds of families. She stood up and looked around the table at faces that were beginning to show respect instead of skepticism. Am I prepared? No. Am I qualified by traditional standards? Probably not. But I understand something that traditional business education doesn't teach. I understand what it means to be on the receiving end of management decisions. I know how it feels when someone with power over your livelihood treats you like you don't matter. She picked up her briefcase and moved toward the door. I'm going to spend the next 6 months learning everything I can about running this company. But I'm also going to remember every day that behind every decision we make, there are real people with real families trying to build better lives. That perspective might be more valuable than any MBA. Sarah walked out of the conference room feeling like she'd just survived her first battle in a war she was only beginning to understand. But she'd survived, and more importantly, she'd established herself as someone who belonged in that room. The elevator ride down felt different than the ride up. This time she wasn't ascending into foreign territory. She was descending back into familiar ground as someone with the authority to change things. On the 3rd floor, she walked past her old desk, now occupied by a temporary worker who looked harried and overwhelmed. Sarah paused, remembering all the times she'd felt exactly the same way, All the moments when a kind word or small gesture of support would have made an enormous difference. "Excuse me," she said to the temp worker, a young man who couldn't be more than 22. "How's your first day going?" He looked up with obvious relief at being acknowledged by someone who seemed friendly. "Honestly, pretty overwhelming. I'm trying to figure out Mr. Hale's filing system, but it doesn't seem to follow any logical pattern." Sarah smiled. "That's because he changes it every few months without telling anyone. Here, let me show you a trick that might help." For the next 15 minutes, Sarah taught the temporary worker shortcuts she'd developed over 22 months of trying to decode Gregory's chaotic organizational methods. She showed him which tasks were genuinely urgent and which ones Gregory just liked to label as emergencies. She explained the quirks of the office equipment and the unwritten rules about lunch breaks and bathroom schedules. "Wow, thank you," the young man said when she finished. "I was starting to think I was too stupid for this job." "Trust me," Sarah said. "You're not the problem. The system is designed to make people feel confused and inadequate. Don't let it get to you." As Sarah left Nexacor that day, she realized she'd just had her first experience of leadership that felt authentic and natural. Not the formal authority of the boardroom, but the informal influence that comes from understanding what people need and being willing to provide it. Maybe that was the kind of leader her grandfather had hoped she'd become. The next 6 months passed in a blur of late nights and early mornings, crash courses in business management and employee relations, and countless meetings with consultants, lawyers, and department heads who were initially skeptical but gradually became cautiously supportive. Sarah hired a business coach who specialized in family-owned companies transitioning to new leadership. She enrolled in online courses in corporate finance and organizational psychology. She read everything Franklin Northcott had written about business philosophy, and everything her mother had saved about workers' rights and fair employment practices. But her most valuable education came from spending time with Nexacor employees at every level of the organization. She instituted weekly coffee hours where anyone could sign up for 15 minutes of unstructured conversation with her. The first few weeks, only 3 or 4 brave souls showed up. By month 3, she had a waiting list. The conversations were revelatory. Software engineers who developed innovative solutions but couldn't get management approval to implement them. Customer service representatives who'd identified patterns in client complaints that pointed to fixable problems. Accounting clerks who'd noticed inefficiencies in billing processes that were costing the company thousands of dollars annually. Sarah took notes on everything, beginning to see Nexacor not as a monolithic corporation, but as a complex ecosystem of intelligent, creative people whose potential was being systematically wasted by management structures that prioritized control over collaboration. The employee profit-sharing program launched in month 2, despite Gregory's vigorous objections about setting dangerous precedents and undermining management authority. The first quarterly bonuses averaged $800 per employee, not enough to change anyone's life dramatically, but enough to demonstrate that the company valued their contributions. The response was immediate and measurable. Productivity increased 17%, sick day usage dropped. The employee satisfaction survey showed marked improvement in every category, with particular gains in feeling valued by management and confidence in company leadership. But the most significant change was in the daily atmosphere of the workplace. People lingered after meetings to continue productive conversations. Collaboration between departments increased organically, as employees felt safer sharing ideas across traditional hierarchical boundaries. The break rooms buzzed with genuine enthusiasm, instead of the resigned complaint sessions Sarah remembered from her administrative assistant days. Gregory fought every change, undermining Sarah's initiatives through passive resistance, strategic miscommunications, and occasional outright sabotage. He seemed to believe that if he could make her fail spectacularly enough, the board would reconsider her leadership and return the company to its previous operations. What he didn't understand was that Sarah's authority came not just from the legal document establishing her ownership, but from the growing support of employees who were experiencing firsthand what it meant to work for an organization that prioritized their well-being alongside profits. 3 months into Sarah's tenure as majority owner, Carmen from accounting approached her after one of the weekly coffee hours. "I need to tell you something," Carmen said, glancing around nervously. "It's about Mr. Hale." Sarah waited, recognizing the body language of someone who wanted to share important information, but was afraid of the consequences. "He's been meeting with executives from Techno Global," Carmen continued. "I process expense reimbursements, so I see the receipts. Multiple dinners at expensive restaurants with their acquisition team. Phone calls that he takes in closed-door meetings. I think he's trying to sell the company out from under you." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Techno Global was exactly the kind of large corporation that would eliminate Nexacor's employee-friendly policies in favor of cost-cutting measures that prioritized short-term profits over long-term sustainability. "Do you have documentation?" Sarah asked. Carmen nodded, pulling a manila folder from her purse. "Copies of the expense reports, meeting schedules, phone logs. I probably shouldn't have made these copies, but something about the whole situation felt wrong." Sarah accepted the folder with gratitude and growing determination. This was exactly the kind of behavior her grandfather had written about in his letters. Managers who prioritized their own power and financial gain over the well-being of the employees they were supposed to serve. But it was also an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of leadership she was trying to build at Nexacor. "Carmen, thank you for bringing this to my attention. But I need you to know that you won't face any retaliation for sharing this information. In fact, I want to create formal channels for employees to report concerns about management practices without fear of punishment." Carmen's relief was visible. "Really? Because I've been worried about this for weeks, but I didn't know who to talk to. Mr. Hale has made it very clear that questioning management decisions is not welcome." "That culture ends now," Sarah said firmly. "Part of building a better workplace is creating systems where people feel safe speaking up when they see problems." That evening, after Max was asleep, Sarah spread Carmen's documentation across their kitchen table alongside Franklin Northcott's letters and her own notes about company culture and leadership philosophy. The evidence was damning. Gregory had been negotiating with Techno Global for at least 2 months, sharing confidential information about Nexacor's operations, client lists, and strategic plans. He was essentially conducting a hostile takeover from the inside, positioning himself to retain power under new ownership, while eliminating the employee-friendly policies Sarah had worked so hard to implement. But as Sarah studied the documents, she realized something important. Gregory's betrayal had been sloppy and arrogant. He'd assumed that no one was paying attention to his activities, that employees like Carmen were too intimidated or too unimportant to notice his scheming. He'd underestimated the culture of engagement and empowerment that Sarah had been building. In the old Nexacor, Carmen would have been too afraid to report suspicious behavior. Employees would have kept their heads down and hoped for the best, while management made decisions that affected their futures without their input. But in Sarah's Nexacor, people felt empowered to speak up when they saw something wrong. They trusted that their concerns would be heard and addressed, rather than dismissed or punished. That trust was about to be tested in a very public way. Have you ever had to choose between playing it safe and standing up for what you believe in? The next morning, Sarah called Eleanor Chen and requested an emergency board meeting. She spent 2 hours with Janet Morrison preparing a presentation that would expose Gregory's attempts to undermine the company, while simultaneously demonstrating why the employee-focused culture they'd been building was both ethically correct and strategically smart. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Sarah walked back into the Nexacor conference room, but this time she felt like she belonged there. 6 months of experience had taught her that leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about asking the right questions and creating space for other people's expertise to flourish. "Thank you all for making time for this emergency meeting," she began, distributing copies of Carmen's documentation around the table. I've called you here because I've uncovered evidence of activities that threaten the integrity and future viability of our company. Gregory's face went white as he recognized the expense reports and meeting schedules. He started to speak, but Sarah continued calmly. For the past 2 months, Gregory Hale has been conducting unauthorized negotiations with Techno Global, sharing confidential company information, and discussing acquisition terms without board approval or knowledge. The CFO studied the documents with growing alarm. These expense reports show multiple meetings with Techno Global executives. Greg, what the hell is this about? Gregory finally found his voice, but it came out higher and more defensive than usual. I was conducting preliminary discussions about potential partnership opportunities, nothing more. Sarah opened her briefcase and withdrew additional documentation Janet Morrison had helped her prepare. Phone records show 14 calls to Techno Global's acquisition department in the past month, she said. Email logs reveal discussions of post-acquisition staffing changes that would eliminate 40% of current positions. And this, she slid a printed document across the table, is a projection of cost savings that could be achieved by eliminating employee profit sharing, comprehensive benefits, and community investment programs. The room fell silent except for the sound of pages turning as board members reviewed the evidence of Gregory's betrayal. Eleanor Chen's expression had shifted from concern to anger, and even the typically reserved CFO looked genuinely upset. Greg, Eleanor said finally, did you really think you could negotiate the sale of a company you don't own without anyone finding out? Gregory's defensive facade cracked, revealing the desperation underneath. This company was fine before she showed up, he said, gesturing angrily at Sarah. We had systems that worked, profit margins that satisfied shareholders, employees who understood their place. Now everything is chaos. Everyone thinks they deserve a voice in management decisions, and we're spending money on feel-good programs that don't contribute to the bottom line. Sarah stood up slowly, drawing on 6 months of experience in managing her own emotional responses during difficult conversations. Gregory, can I ask you something? In your vision of Techno Global ownership, what happens to Carmen in accounting? To Jennifer at the front desk? To the 300 families who depend on Nexicor employment to pay rent and buy groceries and send their kids to college? That's not my problem, Gregory snapped. My responsibility is to maximize shareholder value, not to run a charity for people who should be grateful just to have jobs. And that, Sarah said, is exactly why you're no longer qualified to work here. She turned to address the full board. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm invoking my authority as majority shareholder to terminate Gregory Hale's employment immediately. His betrayal of confidential company information to potential acquirers constitutes grounds for dismissal with cause, voiding any severance agreements or non-compete clauses. Eleanor Chen nodded approvingly. I second the motion. Within 15 minutes, Gregory Hale had been escorted from the building by security, his access to company systems revoked, and his office contents boxed for retrieval later. Sarah watched from the conference room window as he stood on the sidewalk looking lost and angry. Probably for the first time in his career, experiencing the powerlessness and uncertainty that he'd inflicted on countless employees over the years. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt sad for all the time and energy that had been wasted on conflict instead of collaboration, for all the potential that had been squandered because one person's ego mattered more to him than hundreds of other people's well-being. But she also felt hopeful. With Gregory's destructive influence removed, Nexicor could become the kind of workplace her grandfather had envisioned, and her mother would have been proud of. A place where people felt valued and empowered to contribute their best work toward shared goals. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the renovated employee break room, watching Max help other Nexicor children with homework while their parents finished the workday. The company's new family support policies included on-site childcare, flexible scheduling, and educational assistance that made it easier for employees to balance work responsibilities with parenting duties. Max had adapted to their changed circumstances with the resilience of childhood, But Sarah could see how much more relaxed he'd become, since she no longer came home exhausted and stressed every day. Their new house had that yard he'd dreamed of. And yes, they'd gotten the dog, a rescue golden retriever named Charlie, who seemed to understand that his job was to provide unconditional love and playground supervision. But the most significant change was in Sarah herself. 6 months of leadership had taught her that authority derived from service rather than power, that the best decisions emerged from listening to the people who would be most affected by them, and that business success measured only in financial terms was ultimately hollow and unsustainable. Nexacor's financial performance had exceeded projections in every quarter since Gregory's departure. Employee retention rates had improved dramatically, customer satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs, and the company had won 3 awards for workplace excellence and community engagement. More importantly, Sarah walked through the office each day seeing people who seemed genuinely happy to be there. Conversations in hallways were animated and productive rather than fearful and complaining. Employees stayed late not because they were afraid to leave, but because they were excited about projects they were working on. Eleanor Chen had become not just a supportive board member, but a genuine mentor, helping Sarah navigate the complex challenges of corporate leadership, while staying true to the values that had motivated her to accept the role in the first place. "You know," Eleanor said, joining Sarah by the break room window, "when you first walked into our boardroom 9 months ago, I thought you were either incredibly brave or completely naive." "What do you think now?" Sarah asked, watching Max explain multiplication tables to a 6-year-old whose mother worked in software development. "I think you were both," Eleanor replied with a smile. "And I think that combination is exactly what this company needed." Sarah nodded, thinking about her grandfather's letters and her mother's principles, and the long journey from being fired for incompetence to being recognized as an innovative leader in employee relations and corporate social responsibility. "Can I ask you something, Eleanor? Do you think I've proven myself worthy of this inheritance? Has Nexacor become the kind of company my grandfather hoped it would be?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, studying the scene in front of them. Children playing safely while parents worked productively. Employees collaborating across departments without fear of territorial conflicts. A workplace culture built on respect and shared purpose rather than hierarchy and competition. "Sarah, I think your grandfather would be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. But more than that, I think your mother would be proud. You've taken her principles and applied them to business in ways that honor both profitability and humanity." As Sarah walked home that evening, she reflected on the question Janet Morrison would ask when they met next week to finalize the permanent transfer of ownership. What had she learned about leadership and responsibility and the relationship between personal values and professional success? She'd learned that authority without empathy was just bullying with better benefits. She'd learned that the most innovative solutions often came from the people closest to day-to-day operations, rather than from executive strategizing. She'd learned that treating employees like partners rather than resources didn't just improve workplace culture, it improved business outcomes in measurable and sustainable ways. Most importantly, she'd learned that the best way to honor her family's legacy was not to preserve it unchanged, but to adapt it thoughtfully to new circumstances while maintaining its essential commitment to human dignity and community well-being. The rain had stopped by the time Sarah reached their neighborhood, and the late afternoon light made everything look golden and full of possibility. Max was waiting on the front porch with Charlie, both of them eager to share the day's adventures and plan the evening's activities. "Mom, guess what? Mrs. Peterson said her company is thinking about implementing some of the same programs Nexacor has. She wants to know if you'd be willing to talk to her boss about how it works." Sarah smiled, realizing that the changes they'd made at Nexacor were beginning to influence other workplaces in Seattle. Maybe that was how real transformation happened, not through grand gestures or revolutionary manifestos, but through patient, persistent demonstration that there were better ways to treat people and better ways to define success. "I'd be happy to talk with Mrs. Peterson's boss," she said, unlocking their front door and stepping into the warmth of home. But first, how about we walk Charlie to the park and you can tell me everything you learned in school today? As they headed toward the neighborhood park, Sarah thought about the question she'd pose to you, the person listening to this story. Have you ever lived through or known someone who went through something similar? A moment when circumstances forced you to become a different version of yourself, when you discovered capabilities you didn't know you possessed, when you had to choose between accepting limitation and risking transformation? Maybe you've worked for someone like Gregory Hale, who treated employees like disposable resources rather than valuable human beings. Maybe you've felt invisible in meetings where important decisions were made without input from the people who would be most affected. Maybe you've wondered whether it's possible to build organizations that honor both profit and principles, both efficiency and empathy. Sarah's story isn't just about inheriting a company or defeating a bad boss or discovering family secrets. It's about the courage to imagine better ways of structuring power and relationships in workplaces, communities, and our own lives. It's about remembering that behind every corporate decision, every policy change, every management philosophy, there are real families trying to build better futures for themselves and their children. It's about understanding that leadership isn't about having perfect qualifications or complete confidence, but about being willing to listen, learn, and center human dignity in every choice you make. Most of all, it's about believing that ordinary people who've been fired and struggled and felt powerless, can create extraordinary change when they're given the opportunity and support to apply their hard-earned wisdom to problems that matter. Sarah Thompson began this journey as a single mother desperate to provide stability for her son, invisible to people who made decisions about her livelihood, powerless to influence systems that affected her daily life. She ended it as a leader whose innovations in employee relations were being studied by other companies, whose approach to corporate social responsibility was beginning to influence industry standards, whose commitment to treating workers like partners rather than resources was proving successful by every meaningful metric. But she also ended it as someone who never forgot where she came from, who understood that real authority comes from service rather than power, who measured success not just in quarterly profits, but in the well-being of the 300 families whose lives were improved by the choices she made every day. If this story has resonated with you, if you've seen yourself in Sarah's struggles or been inspired by her transformation, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support allows us to keep sharing stories like this, stories about ordinary people creating extraordinary change, stories about the courage to challenge systems that don't serve human dignity, stories about the possibility of building better workplaces and communities and lives. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's been made to feel invisible or incompetent by people in power, someone who's wondered whether their experience and perspective have value in professional settings that seem designed for different kinds of people, someone who's dreamed of creating change, but doubted their qualifications or capabilities. Because the truth Sarah Thompson discovered, and the truth this story is meant to remind all of us, is that the most important qualification for leadership isn't an advanced degree or decades of experience or connections to people with influence. The most important qualification for leadership is remembering what it's like to be powerless and choosing to use whatever authority you gain in service of people who are still struggling in ways you understand from your own experience. That's a lesson worth inheriting, worth implementing, and worth passing on to the next generation of leaders who will face their own moments of choice between preserving the status quo and risking transformation in service of something better. Thank you for listening to Sarah's story. Thank you for believing that change is possible, that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things, and that the courage to imagine better ways of living and working together is one of the most valuable inheritances we can leave for our children.